The elevator opened with a low mechanical sigh, exhaling him into a world he barely recognized. The office layout had changed. The branding was different. Gone were the heavy server towers and whiteboards layered in marker. Now everything was touch-sensitive, voice-activated, and moodlit. The walls glowed with mission statements no one lived by and slogans looped on the lobby screen in soft pastels. We don't work. We evolve. He stood still for a moment, letting the space settle around him. The company he had created 2 decades ago, line by line, brick by brick, had become a stranger. A unicorn startup with a valuation too big to fail and too hollow to remember who made it possible. His name wasn't on the wall anymore, but the code still bore his signature. Somewhere deep in the architecture, in lines never overwritten, lived the fingerprint of the man they'd all dismissed. He was 64 now. A heart attack behind him. A limp in his left leg. But his mind? His mind was still the machine that built this place. They had buried him under equity dilution, framed him as a legacy advisor, and slowly nudged him into the shadows of irrelevance. But he had never left completely. He had been watching. And now he was done waiting. Upstairs, the staff overflowed with brilliance and caffeine. Desks were clustered in playful chaos, standing pods, gaming corners, beanbags near meditation rooms. Departments were defined more by playlist choice than by purpose. Employees floated through the space like frictionless atoms, efficient, charming, and distracted. He moved past them unnoticed. His presence was a glitch in their design, something unstyled, unapproved. The badge he wore was old but still scannable. No one questioned it. They assumed he was some vendor, maybe the father of an investor. Irrelevant. He watched developers pitch ideas he had drawn out on napkins in another century. Watched engineers repackage what he'd built, claiming it as disruption. The platform now had features he didn't understand, but the spine of it was still his. He passed a hallway named after a marketing VP who hadn't been born when the first line of code was written. He didn't speak. He just walked. At the far end of the floor, the executive wing stood behind glass like a fishbowl of ambition. The CEO's office, his old office, was now occupied by someone who looked like an advertisement for venture capital. All angles and buzzwords, dressed like he was always on the way to a TED Talk. His desk was sleek and sterile. No paper. Just a glowing screen and a crystal decanter of water that cost more than Jalen's first computer. The man behind the desk didn't notice him at first. Until Jalen opened the door without knocking. The movement snapped him out of whatever dashboard he was admiring. There was a beat of silence. Then confusion. Then offense. Then almost hilarity. "I'm sorry, who are you?" Jalen walked past him and stood at the window. The city outside was newer, taller. But the view was the same. He took a breath. His chest didn't hurt anymore. He turned and said 5 words. "Check the original incorporation papers." Security was called. Until legal confirmed the signature. Until archived documents surfaced. Until one executive who had been with the company since its garage days stepped into the room, pale as ash, holding a folder. It was a founding agreement. Signed, dated, and never revoked. Buried under revisions, yes, but not erased. The clause was simple: in the event of leadership crisis, the founding partner retains executive authority unless formally removed by vote. There had never been a vote. Not once. Because they had assumed he would never come back. He had come back. Outside the office, a crowd began to gather. Not out of curiosity, but confusion. Because for the first time in a decade, someone had walked in without permission. And wasn't being asked to leave. The headlines came quickly. By the end of the day, tech media was aflame. Ex-founder reclaims control of $2 billion startup after legal oversight. The return of the ghost in the machine. Photos circulated of him standing silently beside the glass desk. While the current CEO, now referred to as former, stormed from the building, jaw clenched, camera flashes in his wake. To some, it looked like a coup. To others, justice. But to Jalen, it was neither. It was a reset. The next morning, he arrived before sunrise. The security guard at the front desk saluted him nervously, unsure of what power dynamics governed this new order. Jalen just nodded and walked in. The company's C-suite had all but dissolved overnight. Some resigned before their contracts could be questioned. Others clung to conference rooms, holding emergency strategy calls that echoed like panic behind glass. He let them swirl. He didn't fire anyone. Not yet. He just sat at the head of the long table where ideas once mattered and listened. Listened to the systems they'd broken in the name of growth. Listen to how products were now built for stockholders instead of people. Listen to the engineers who hadn't shipped anything meaningful in years. Listen to the designers begging to care again. And when he was done listening, he asked only one question. What did we stop doing when we started succeeding? Silence. Then slowly, truth. We stopped building. We just optimized. He spent the next few weeks walking the floors. Not as a boss, as an archaeologist. He pulled up wireframes from old archives. Debugged ancient features that had been patched, not fixed. He spoke to interns, janitors, people in customer support who knew more about the real user than any of the executives ever had. They asked him why he was here. Why now? He said nothing. But inside he knew. Because the company had become exactly what he swore it never would be. A machine for mediocrity. Polished. Scalable. Hollow. Investors panicked. They demanded board meetings. Demanded he step down. Too old. Too slow. Not in step with modern markets. He sent them a slideshow. Contained 2 pages. Page 1. A list of every feature launched in the last 5 years. Most were deprecated or underused. Page 2. A simple graph, monthly active users since launch. The sharp upward line ended in a slow, irreversible decline. Attached was one line. I built the rocket. You turned it into a spreadsheet. Now I'm relighting the engines. That quarter he paused all ad campaigns. Redirected the budget toward product dev. Rehired the original back-end team. Cut licensing deals that drained more money than they made. Brought back engineers who had walked away in frustration. And gave them a mandate. Build something no one's seen before. Or leave. But don't waste my time with fear. It was chaos. But it was alive. In the break room, a young UX designer asked if he was tired. Jalen smiled. He hadn't slept this little in years. He hadn't felt this awake since the beginning. One night, long after everyone else had gone home, he stood alone in the office with a prototype glowing softly on the desk. A tool the new team had created in silence, off the roadmap, beyond the sprint cycle. It was elegant, powerful, unmistakably familiar, because beneath the shine, it carried the heartbeat of the thing they had all once believed in. He touched the screen, pulsed to life, and in that instant he remembered why he had come back. Not to lead, not to punish, but to remind them that he never stopped being the future. The relaunch was subtle. No parties, no rooftop drones, no influencer countdowns. Just a single update pushed quietly to users, with release notes that read, "We've been listening. Welcome back." And people noticed, not because of flashy features, but because something had changed in how the app felt, how it responded, how it understood. What had once become bloated and robotic was now lean, intuitive, alive. Comments flooded in from users who had long given up. This is what it used to feel like. Why does it finally work again? Behind the curtain, Jalen worked without ceremony. He wasn't interested in reclaiming fame. He had already seen what happened when the wrong people were celebrated. What mattered now was building something that made the world stop for just a second. And look, his days were consumed in code reviews and product meetings that actually meant something. He no longer tolerated meetings about metrics without meaning. Virality was a word that no longer held power, only impact. And his team, they started to change too. At first, they resisted. He was older, slower, analog. He didn't speak in buzzwords, didn't pitch in GIFs. He brought notebooks to stand-ups, scribbled diagrams, wrote bug notes in margins. But when he pointed out a flaw in the system architecture no one else had seen, one that could have cost millions, the room shifted. They started calling him OG behind his back. He didn't mind. He'd been called worse. Word spread. Other founders, long pushed out of their own companies, started reaching out. Quiet messages. Some curious. Some desperate. One simply wrote, "Did they forget who we were?" Jalen responded with 3 words. Then remind them. It wasn't just a company now. It was a reckoning. He began holding private gatherings, not keynotes, not panels. Conversations. In living rooms. In old co-working spaces. In hacker dens lit by laptop glow. He told stories about the days when startups were fueled by hunger, not seed rounds. When shipping a broken product felt like betrayal, not a milestone. He reminded them what it meant to build. Then came the offer from a global tech conglomerate. $10 billion, cash and stock, a full buyout, control of the platform, the patents, the brand. Jalen read the proposal. The paperwork was beautiful. The offer letter practically glowed. He laughed, then sent them a reply. I didn't come back to sell it. I came back to save it. The board braced for fallout. Instead, the opposite happened. The refusal made headlines. Not scandal, admiration. A founder who said no. A man in his 60s turning down the kind of money that made CEOs faint. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know more. And the company, its user base surged. Not because of the code, but because of the conviction. One morning, he arrived early, before even the cleaning crews. He walked through the empty office, passing desks where people had once doubted him. Now they asked him for guidance. He stood by the same window where he'd once been told he was too old to lead, and stared out at the city that had forgotten him, until he made them remember. Then, almost to himself, he whispered, "They thought I was done. I'm just getting started." They couldn't understand why he wasn't tired. He was older than everyone in the building. Most of the leadership team didn't have childhood memories before the internet. They spoke in acronyms. They moved fast. But he moved with intention. While they scrambled to optimize, he simplified. While they focused on scale, he focused on soul. And slowly, the culture began to shift. He removed the ping-pong tables. Not out of disdain, but because they had become symbols of distraction, not joy. He canceled performance reviews and replaced them with peer conversations. Not quarterly metrics, but weekly honesty. He got rid of the productivity dashboard that ranked employees by code commits and ticket resolutions. Instead, he introduced one metric. Did we make something real this week? At first, there was rebellion. Then relief. People began arriving earlier, leaving later, not because they were being watched, but because they finally felt seen. He brought back a ritual from the company's early days. Every Friday at 5 p.m., the lights dimmed, and one person stood before the company. Not to pitch, not to present, but to tell a story about their life, their failures, their families, their dreams. They called it Heartbeat. He was the first to go. He spoke of the day he was pushed out, the silence afterward, the bitterness, the long nights replaying decisions, the near death that reminded him how short time really was. He spoke not as a leader, but as a man who had lost his voice and reclaimed it by returning to the thing he loved most, creating. That night, no one looked at him the same way again, not as a relic, but as a reminder of what building meant before it became branding. Investors still circled. They always would. But now, he held the room when he walked into shareholder meetings. He no longer argued for innovation. He demonstrated it. The product team launched a suite of accessibility features weeks ahead of schedule because one customer, a blind woman in Detroit, had sent an email saying she wished she could use the app with her brother. That email was pinned to the whiteboard for months. Not as PR. As purpose. Jalen also made one final, quiet change. He restored the original plaque that used to hang in the office foyer. It had been taken down during a redesign. He found it in storage, wiped the dust from the brass, hung it where everyone would see it again. It read, "This company wasn't built to exit. It was built to matter." And slowly, the world noticed again. Not because of ads, not because of virality, but because something real had returned. Because people began talking about the company not as a brand, but as a force. Something they believed in. Something they could feel. Because an old man walked back into a building and reminded them what it meant to build something worth keeping. The comeback had done more than restore a company. It had triggered a shift in the entire industry. For years, startups had operated like flashbulbs, brilliant bursts that faded just as fast. Ideas were sold before they ever lived. Founders became influencers. Vision became valuation. But Jalen's return broke the pattern. Not because of nostalgia, but because it worked. His leadership wasn't fast. It was precise. And in a world addicted to new, precision was revolutionary. Media outlets wanted to frame him as a redemption arc. From forgotten to front page. He refused every profile. He wasn't interested in being a story. He was interested in setting a standard. Behind the scenes, he launched an initiative called Roots. It wasn't a product. It wasn't even public. It was a mentorship network for founders over 50. People the tech world had cast aside, laughed at, or replaced with younger versions of themselves. He spoke to dozens, then hundreds. A woman who invented the backbone of a wireless protocol but hadn't worked in a decade. A man who pioneered early encryption and was now teaching high school math. A former engineer who had built an accessibility app for her disabled son completely alone. Jalen didn't make speeches. He made introductions. He gave them space. He built a fund not to invest in companies but to invest in people, with clauses that forbade exit strategies and enforced community impact. He called it Second Flame, because some fires take longer to light. Within the company, the team had changed. People now came not for the perks but the principle. Old team members returned not for money but for meaning. Younger employees stayed not for security but for substance. There was friction, of course. Generations don't always translate. But Jalen didn't mediate through HR. He mediated through mission. He brought them together in project rooms, not conflict rooms. Had them co-create features? Let wisdom shape momentum and momentum challenge tradition. The results weren't just functional. They were unforgettable. One feature they shipped, Pause Mode, allowed users to disengage from the app with a personal timer that encouraged rest. It went viral not because it was innovative but because it gave people back something no other app dared to offer: silence. Tech leaders mocked it, then copied it. One afternoon, a group of college founders came to visit the office. Wide-eyed, loud, brilliant. They wanted advice. He gave them a question instead. If your company disappeared tomorrow, would anyone miss it? Or would they just move on to the next app? Silence. Then nods. Then notebooks opened. At 11:17 p.m. that same night, he sat alone in the office. Old Jazz playing through his laptop. A half-drunk cup of cold coffee beside him. He looked out the window, same view he'd seen for 20 years. The city pulsed below, still younger, still faster. But he smiled. Because he built something not just to survive the rush, but to outlive it. The building was quiet on his last morning. He unlocked the front door himself, same keycard, same gentle beep. The receptionist's desk was unstaffed. The screens were asleep. But the walls? They remembered. The floorboards still held the weight of his first team. Back when they sat cross-legged during stand-ups because chairs were a luxury. Now the company employed over 1,000 people across 5 countries. But some things hadn't changed. The mission, the product, and the heartbeat behind it all. He didn't announce his departure. He didn't want the company to stop. He wanted it to keep moving without him. He'd rebuilt it not in his image, but in his absence. Made himself unnecessary by making others better. Empowered the quiet thinkers. Listened to the unheard. Opened the door wide enough for future architects to walk through without needing to ask permission. He didn't write a farewell email. He wrote code. One last commit push to the main branch. // there's always more to build. But someone else can carry the torch now. That afternoon, the executive team gathered for a regular strategy session. He wasn't there. Instead, they found an envelope. Inside, a letter. No emotion. Just instructions. I was the foundation, not the frame. Keep building. And don't let the numbers matter more than the names. Attached was a list of every employee who had worked at the company in year 1. Some were still there. Most had been forgotten. Jalen hadn't. He never did. He walked out the back exit. No cameras. No send-off. Just one man in a coat, older than the rest, shoulders straight. Outside, the world buzzed. Faster than ever. Startups launched, failed, relaunched. Apps peaked and disappeared. Founders rose and faded. But the company, it endured. Not because it was rich, not because it was loud, but because it had roots. And in the years that followed, new products would rise from those roots. New leaders, new voices, but they would all point back, quietly, respectfully, to the man who came back when no one expected, and reminded them that vision doesn't have an expiration date. And that legacy doesn't retire.